My name is Robyn. I'm a professor of sustainability transitions at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and will host today's seminar. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm based, the Boonwurrung people, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. So I'm very pleased that today Robyn is our speaker, our very own Robyn. Robyn Mansfield is currently in her last phases of finishing up her PhD, and I'm really happy she was able to make time to present this webinar at this webinar today. So in her PhD project, Robyn explores the need, challenges, and opportunities for children participation in urban planning processes, and in particular in vulnerable settings. And she develops a novel framework based on institutional logics, theories, and through a range of case studies, generates insights and recommendations for mainstreaming children participation in urban planning. And that will also be the topic of today. And before joining MSDI, you already had a substantial career in local government and consultancy across various regions of the world, working on community livelihoods, disaster risk reduction, and reconstruction projects. And you hold, I think, 2 master's degrees in relevant fields, and I've also taught and lectured at Monash, Armity, and Griffith University. I think I'll give the floor to yours. Everyone listening in, please think about questions that you will, or comments that you would like to present or pose to Robyn after about 30 or 40 minutes, the time that Robyn will talk. And feel free to either post them in the chat or preferably just raise your hand during the Q&A, and we'll give the floor to you. All right, Robyn, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, firstly, thank you, Rob, for that introduction, and welcome everyone today, and thank you for your interest in this important topic. I would first like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose country I'm presenting from today, and all traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I'd like to start this presentation with the story that led me down this path. With an extensive background as a public sector landscape architect, I was part of many community engagement processes. In this key example, my team developed a participatory process that included children for the design of a playground. The children's contributions extended beyond play and demonstrated their deep connection to the local environment, stories, and social connections. They created the image of a far more socially and environmentally connected world, and we made the commitment that we would honour this world in the design of the play space. So it sounds pretty risk-free. But we encountered barriers immediately: resistance from the designers, the politicians who funded the project, the over 2,000 comments on social media during and after the construction phase. The retribution was vicious and utterly perplexing. Reflecting the children's experiences in the infrastructure profoundly influenced the behaviour of children and adults alike. Patronage dramatically increased, with overflow parking being advertised up to 1 kilometre away. Food trucks started coming and reported great business. The backlash subsided, but never really went away, as people were fixed in their views on what a playground should look like. It was the desire to realise the better world the children described that led me to explore why children continue to be excluded from urban planning processes, and that when they participate in these processes, their voices and aspirations for the urban environment are broadly rejected. Ultimately, the research is designed to position children as active citizens in civil society and to propose recommendations to mainstream Sustainable Development Goal 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. The UN Sustainable Development Goal progress reports identify that children are among the most vulnerable population groups, and that countries susceptible to disasters and unsustainable urbanisation form the most vulnerable settings. These vulnerabilities are greatly impacting our ability to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. 2 key global policies support this research. The first policy draws on Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which legally binds all state signatories to ensure that children's voices are heard in all matters affecting them. At the time of this presentation, every country in the world except for the USA has ratified the convention, and in particular that article. The second policy focus is on the UN Agenda Transforming Our World, the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, specifically SDG 11, Target 11.3, which states that by 2030, enhance inclusive and sustainable urbanisation and capacity for participatory, integrated and sustainable human settlement planning and management in all countries. These two policies intersect through the Committee on the Rights of the Child reporting process. From 2019, the committee has requested that states report on how the planning, implementation and monitoring of measures for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals integrate a child rights-based approach, including with regard to child participation. Intersecting academic bodies of literature were examined at a high level and were selected based on the core themes that sit within SDG 11's definition of human settlement planning. These initial high-level findings demonstrated a need for research into children's participation in urban planning processes with a particular focus on vulnerable settings. This presentation will first outline the problem my PhD research set out to explore and provide a brief overview of the methods. I will then present the research findings under a series of themes using consolidated data. First, I will present the impact of children's participation or exclusion from urban planning processes in vulnerable settings. I will then present the barriers and enablers to children's participation. And last, I will present pathways to mainstreaming children's participation. For the purposes of this research, urban planning is defined using UN Habitat's definition as urban and territorial planning as a decision-making process aimed at realising economic, social, cultural and environmental goals through the development of spatial visions, strategies and plans, and the application of a set of policy principles, tools, institutional and participatory mechanisms and regulatory procedures. When I refer to children, I am referring to all people under the age of 18. It is critical to note that this research is not an evaluation of any of the studies, their activities or people. It simply identifies what is occurring with a view to developing pathways for change. This thesis is viewed through a critical realism lens, recognising Basker's assertion that the social world is reproduced and transformed in daily life, and that identification of the structures that generate that world can help to enact change to address inequalities and injustices. The three research problems looked at in my thesis include limited understanding of barriers, enablers, and underlying causes of children's participation in urban planning processes for vulnerable settings, no comprehensive conceptual framework for analysing children's participation in urban planning for vulnerable settings, and a limited understanding of the pathways to mainstreaming children's participation in urban planning for vulnerable settings. The research methods involved a critical analysis of the literature environment and a series of qualitative case studies spanning different types of vulnerable settings. The case studies focus on the decision makers of these processes who were interviewed to better understand the individual, organisational and societal factors that shape children's participation. All case studies generated information demonstrating the impact of children's inclusion or exclusion from urban planning processes. The first two case studies are focused on post-disaster reconstruction in Ecuador after the 2016 earthquake and Australia after the bushfires of 2009. These case studies indicated a need for further research into understanding how to challenge barriers to children's participation and the impact of intersectional issues to meet the specific needs of subsets of children. The semi-systematic literature review determined what we know about barriers and enablers to children's participation in areas of greatest vulnerability. Using Laughlin et al.'s Analysing Social Settings framework to operationalise a critical realist approach to analysing the literature, the key themes, structures and processes that influence urban planning processes, and the consequences of children's inclusion or exclusion were identified. A research agenda was then developed focusing on the institutional influences on decisions to include or exclude children in urban planning processes. The third case study focuses on the Revitalizing Informal Settlements and Their Environments, or RISE program in Suva, Fiji. RISE is a research program that is trialling a new water-sensitive urban design approach to water and sanitation upgrades in informal settlements. The program includes randomised control trials across 12 informal settlements in Fiji and 12 in Indonesia. The aim of the program is to expand the approach worldwide to improve the lives of people living in informal settlements. The RISE program covers an expansive breadth of urban planning processes, from land tenure to specific project design and implementation, with longer-term issues of maintenance and governance. The program also has funded participatory components such as co-design. This presents a unique opportunity to examine children's participation across a range of urban planning areas and determine whether barriers and enablers vary across different aspects of the program. The final case study examined potential pathways for mainstreaming children's participation in these processes by examining the work of the organisation Untitled that has achieved some success in influencing change and has mainstreamed children's participation in urban projects in its own organisational practices. Untitled is a non-profit organisation that seeks to strengthen communities experiencing crisis through collaborative art making in vulnerable settings. While their focus is on participatory urban art, the works have generated health, safety, social, and potentially peace-building outcomes. For the purposes of this study, I've focused on their work in refugee and internally displaced person settlements. Case studies and interviews span the globe and providing some insight into the impacts of localised cultural impacts and personal belief systems. While the research is not intended to be globally representative, it does demonstrate that many of the issues impacting children's participation in urban planning processes are reflected regardless of the location and greatly impacted by the institutional system they sit within. Across all case studies, there were similar themes reflecting the impact of participation on children and on programs. There was a recognition that children become empowered when participating, that they feel they have some sort of control over decisions that impact their local area, and that it positively impacts their mental health. It was acknowledged that children have skill and capacity and are able to grasp technical concepts that adults find challenging. Many interviewees identified that their participation was likely to result in different built outcomes. Beyond the immediate project, there was speculation that children's participation could actually positively impact broader societal issues such as discrimination and radicalisation. Children's participation also impacted the adult staff and participants in the programs. A number of staff were surprised by the capacity, creativity, and knowledge of children, their ability to work across age groups, and by the sense of fun they imparted in formal aspects of the program, which boosted the engagement of adults. It was also seen as a potential solution for the prevention of crime or dangerous activities. The exposure to the potential of children's participation had many interviewees speculating as to how they build children's participation into future programs. On the downside, the exclusion of children from urban planning processes in these settings was reported to have dire results. The post-disaster reconstruction process in Ecuador demonstrated that when children are excluded from the reconstruction process, both from participating and from having their built environment needs met, the consequences are extremely damaging, with potentially lasting impact on the whole of the community and potentially lasting for generations. In this case, the earthquake resulted in the loss of children's cultural, educational, home and recreational spaces and activities. Soon after, residents reported that children became drawn into a devastating drug culture of addiction and dealing. Signs were placed around the town encouraging children to choose education and a happy life over drugs, and some residents were trying to entice children back to positive cultural activities such as dance to draw them out of the drug culture. The connection between children's exclusion and drug use was also identified in one of the other case studies. The literature review identified that the consequences of excluding children from participating or providing poor quality participatory processes not only had consequences in itself, but resulted in poor urban planning and infrastructure outcomes. The impact of a poor built environment includes problems such as risk to physical safety, vandalism, feelings of fear, perceptions of harm, including from other children, lowered quality of life, less access to open space, leading to higher rates of obesity, particularly in poor neighbourhoods, lack of autonomy and mobility, important for social development, safety issues such as traffic accidents and other issues, poor air quality, misuse of infrastructure leading to disease, infection or death. The post-disaster case studies and literature review indicated that the barriers to children's participation lay with individual, organisational and societal barriers. The Australian case study indicated that barriers to children's participation in their work lies with individuals and the organisational systems they work within. The literature identified that barriers could broadly be classified as structural conditions such as poverty, societal views of children, and their lack of a role and power within the political and economic systems. Procedural barriers were identified as greatly impacted by economic and political systems, generating adult-led processes often with poor impacts and a lack of acceptance of the outcomes from participatory processes. The case study in Informal Settlements Rise formed the key study for identifying the factors that shape children's participation. The first step was to generate an understanding of the types of participation that have occurred to the time of the study. These terms build on research by Kiralee Pells, whose research resulted in the development of the terms lived and performed as to how children see participatory activities. Understanding of what is participation, its purpose and impact was identified as a key barrier. The generally held belief was that participation is a formal activity designed to extract information or some form of data from children, and that if no data is required, then children don't need to participate. Less understood was the recognition that participation can be mutually beneficial, such as children developing new skills. The value of agentic processes where children instigate a form of participation, which is then reliant on acceptance, recognition or support by an adult. And the idea of lived participation, defined as ongoing, embedded in daily lives and manifesting as supportive relationships. Lived participation is an area that warrants more research due to indications that this is a preferred form of participation by children and has potential to create the greatest societal impact based on the trusting relationships that develop in communities. The data was then used to identify the individual, organisational and societal factors that influence children's participation in RISE and the causal factors that sometimes result in contradictory results. This case study utilises Thornton et al.'s institutional logics perspective as a framework to develop an in-depth exploration of the causal behaviours that impact children's participation in the program at an individual, organisational and societal level. Materials, tools, rituals, motivations, sense of self, activities, artefacts or objects that shape individuals and organisations' behaviour that ultimately creates barriers and enablers, how each of these influence each other, and how this can be used to develop pathways towards mainstreaming children's participation. As an example, if you think back to the playground example I provided in my introduction, there are a number of logics in conflict with each other. The decision to develop a child participatory process for the design phase of the playground stemmed from a professional association with the quality of the project, coupled with a personal investment in children, stemming from a commitment to community values and a belief in democratic participation, noting that in this context, children were identified as a specific group within the broader community. Backlash included from those who see this type of work legitimised through their own personal perceived expertise or through background politics fueled through social media, with Facebook comments indicating alignment with family hierarchies where children may have less voice, or through a market logic characteristic where value for money was a key driver, and then applying pressure as a political voter. The conflicting institutional logics here demonstrate conflicts between family, community, state, market, and professional logics. The data analysis resulted in the classification of RISE into a children's participation logic, recognising that within other areas of RISE, different logics may be influencing behaviours and decisions. Generally, factors that aligned with state logic supported participation, while factors that aligned with a corporation logic did not. Other institutionals were less dominating, yet still impacted at various levels. How this plays out in RISE is demonstrated in the following example. The original funding application supported co-design of the water infrastructure. While certain characteristics of the infrastructure were engineered, community participation in this process was regarded as critical to the success of the project and allowed residents of the informal settlements to influence key aspects of the project. It is important to note that children were not specifically identified as being part of the co-design process. The requirement for co-design translated into specific tasks in some job roles. Those who were directly responsible for co-design processes in their job roles developed performed participatory processes such as co-design workshops. While children were not specifically targeted to participate in these processes, children sometimes attended for various reasons, and depending on the personal belief systems of the staff in charge, children then participated in these workshops. As children weren't specifically invited to many workshops, in some cases there was no participation by children. When children did participate in the workshops, their confidence in approaching RISE staff increased, and the opportunities for lived participation increased. An example involved children offering to act as translators when the hired translator was unavailable. When job roles did not specify responsibility for co-design processes, generally children did not participate. However, some of these interviews provided powerful examples of lived participation as this aligned with their source of identity. These examples included children acting on their personal agency, requesting to participate in activities that RISE staff were undertaking in the field, and resulting in informal discussions to do with further studies and career planning related to the field work for planning and implementation of the water infrastructure. Underpinning these decisions that led to the types of participation undertaken by children were issues of legitimacy, sources of authority and personal identity, norms, the focus of people's attention, strategies for achieving their goals, and control mechanisms. Overall, this case study demonstrated that limited understanding of the purpose and types of participation was a key factor that impacted how and whether participation occurred and in what parts of RISE. Secondly, the institutional logics model demonstrates that there is a myriad of complex intertwined factors that sit at societal, organisational and individual levels that often contradict each other and perpetuate exclusionary practices. The logics model does not sit in isolation, but is influenced by and linked to societal and external logics, theories, frames, narratives, vocabularies of practice, resource environments and practices, all of which contribute to the broader culture of children's participation. These other aspects are progressed in the final case study, which examines the specific conditions, actions and behaviours that have influenced support for children's participation in refugee and internally displaced people settlements. The analysis of the Artolution case study seeks to understand how these specific conditions have influenced institutional change. This study is framed by Thornton et al.'s Institutional Logics Analytic Framework in order to test learning from the previous case. The research is furthered by then using Thornton et al.'s cultural emergence model to determine the specific components that create change towards mainstreaming of children's participation in those contexts. Generating children's participation in urban planning processes for vulnerable settings such as IDP and refugee camps is not conventional practice, which requires the development of a new type of participatory logic that challenges rigid governance policies and standards. The interview data demonstrated that there are key individuals associated with Artolution, either as staff members or supporters, who demonstrate an increased aptitude for innovating and creating change. These individuals are known as entrepreneurs. Cultural entrepreneurs are skilled cultural operators who are able to justify their interventions through methods such as storytelling, and institutional entrepreneurs are skilled at generating resources by exploiting institutions. This model is based on the behaviours, processes and activities that Artolution currently undertake to generate support for their work, the components that have influenced support, and the recommended cultural symbols and material practices that would further embed support for their work. Children's participation has been partially embedded into Artolution's work through strong frames and narratives underpinned by a theory that children's participation enhances social cohesion. As an organisation, interviewees demonstrated personal investment in vulnerable populations with a strong focus on equity and inclusion. This personal investment manifests as passion, commitment and drive, resulting in a building of the resource environment through networks, solidifying particular types of practices and a culture of developing cultural and institutional entrepreneurs. These entrepreneurs serve an important role, particularly for unique and innovative activities that are considered superfluous to urban planning operations. The adapted cultural emergence model shown demonstrates that there are strong foundations for processes that support children's participation in a field that generally recognises children as recipients of humanitarian intervention rather than as active participants. Overall, the findings indicate that ultimately individuals are responsible for the inclusion or the exclusion from children's participation in urban planning processes for vulnerable settings, but may be operating in a hostile institutional environment that impedes their ability to enable children's participation. Institutions are continually shaped, moulded and perpetuated by individuals. As Thornton et al. Demonstrate in their case studies, one individual has the capacity to transform an entire field through their manipulation of the accepted institutional logics within that field. The figure I'm about to show you combines the findings from all 5 papers into a model of developing pathways towards mainstreaming based on consolidating Laughlin and Co.'s Analysing Social Settings framework and Thornton et al.'s Institutional Logics framework, cultural emergence model, and definitions of institutional and cultural entrepreneurs. The resulting model holds individuals accountable for perpetuating types of participation, including no participation, and demonstrates the process for recruiting cultural and institutional entrepreneurs who have the skills and drive to reshape the environment and reconfigure organisations, societies, and institutional fields. The 3 phases of the model are as follows. In the formative phase, the case studies and literature highlighted the role of individuals in driving and developing participatory practices. The individuals who tended to gain most traction were those who exhibited a strong belief in children's participation, a drive to generate support either through developing cultural narratives or exploiting institutional systems to garner resources and agency for acting on this belief and mobilising support. Some of these individuals demonstrated a broad understanding of the different types of participation, evidenced by the range of types, the frequency with which they engage children's participation, their knowledge of the impact or consequences of children's participation, and their theories on why children's participation is important. The individuals operated in a range of organisational settings aligned with different institutional logics and with varying measures of success in identifying the relevant actors through which they could generate support and act on children's participatory processes. This particular step in the process demonstrated that the development of the theories, frames and narratives must expand to encompass the external environment to align with multiple institutional logics in order to generate the attention, mobilise support and build a resource environment in a very diverse field. While the case studies and literature articulated the need to align with multiple logics, there was no demonstration of developing theories, frames and narratives that aligned with the different institutional logics, leading to limited understanding and support for participatory processes. That's not to say it doesn't occur, but that's purely acknowledging the information that was imparted through the interview processes. This has resulted in the process of children's participation remaining in an inward-focused formative phase, thus limiting its potential for mainstreaming. In the expansion phase, the formative phase becomes outward-focused, linking to external logics and expanding into organisational processes through the development of theories, frames, narratives, and vocabularies of practice. The RISE case study in particular developed a vocabulary of practice around the term co-design. Allowing this narrative to be built into embedded in the broader organisational system of RISE. Specific child participation practices demonstrated in the Artolution case study also demonstrated that how children participated could influence the forming of stories that provide sense to this participation for external actors, further contributing to the expansion of children's participation beyond the case study. Successful expansion is highly dependent on the formation of stories that make sense to other actors and directly connect children's participation to individuals, organisational and societal or external logics. For instance, in order to align with organisations built around a market logic, stories regarding children's participation must make sense and alignment with market logics such as efficiency, profit and transactional approaches. The normative phase builds on the activities in the RISE and Artolution case studies that demonstrated some measure of success, drawing on Thornton et al.'s notion that in order for all actors to become embedded in a culture of children's participation, these logic categories and practices must be reified, or rather generated as the natural order of things. The act of reifying children's position was not identified in any of the case studies or literature review and is potentially the missing key towards a pathway of mainstreaming. In this model, normalising children's participation builds on the inherent knowledge and skills within individuals recognised as cultural and institutional entrepreneurs, equipping them with the tools to develop pathways towards mainstreaming children's participation on a scale expanded beyond their individual world. A key tool is the ability to identify opportunities for getting attention and mobilising the right actors. The model then proposes that mainstreaming is likely to be achieved through a process of recruiting more individuals and equipping them with the skills to mobilise collective action towards organisational and societal change that supports and embeds children's participation as normalised within urban planning processes. This model identifies one option for recruiting potential entrepreneurs for mobilising children's participation. The results of the interviews demonstrates that urban planners become ambassadors for their field in participatory processes, influencing children's field of study and career aspirations. The results also demonstrate that this can impact how people support children's participation in their chosen careers. While this study was limited in scope, it provides some insight into possible methods for mainstreaming children's participation in urban planning and serves as a reminder that children are the future generation that will be tasked with tackling complex human settlement planning. Generating interest in how urban planning can make a difference will help to equip children with the knowledge and skills to positively impact the urban environment. Highlighting urban planning as a career option and demystifying the field needs greater participation of children in all aspects of urban planning. As some interviewees suggested that higher education may influence practitioners to involve children in their work, there is scope for incorporating children's participation into higher education curricula. The findings in this research and the limitations both present a number of areas for future study. The research provides a number of opportunities for expanding this research, operationalising the research, and testing its application in the field in a range of vulnerable settings. More specifically, future research should further these findings by developing a comparative study to check children's perspectives, test the mainstreaming of children's participation by using the recommendations developed through the use of the institutional logics and cultural emergence models, and also to test the impact of framings of participation against the participation typology. Operationalising the findings of this research can be tested in practice by organisations. Future research into the impacts of any changes by organisations should include a monitoring and evaluation model to determine the levels of success, ideally led by children, and identify the specific components of the recommendations that create the strongest impact on mainstreaming. Ideally, future studies would also monitor the impact of including children's participation, curricula and activities on individuals' propensity for embedding children's participation in their work. This study highlights that children's participation in urban planning processes for vulnerable settings is shaped by complex institutional factors. Furthermore, this study shines a spotlight on the critical nature of children's participation, identifying potential far-reaching consequences that support a global agenda for children's participation. This research thus provides one pathway supporting this goal and taking steps towards the mainstreaming of children's participation in urban planning processes for vulnerable settings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robyn. That was a very good presentation. Well done. Very interesting, although obviously I've been following the work myself as one of your supervisors, but it's again and again really good to hear you talk about it as well, because you're so good at providing that narrative across all of the different parts of the work you've been doing. So well done. I would now like to invite anyone from the audience to ask a question, make a comment, give your thoughts on what Robyn just presented. And feel free just to use the buttons to raise your hand and turn your camera on to ask a question, or put a question in the chat if you prefer that. There's always someone that needs to break the ice first. And let me ask a question first, Robyn. What would be methods or approaches that you would recommend in terms of good children participation? What kind of toolbox, if you like, would follow from your research? Do you have any? I know it's not been the core of your research, but what would you on the spot think about what participants in urban planning processes could better do to enable children participation?
Yeah, sure, Rob. There's a lot of manuals out there that have these ideas of performed processes that you can undertake. The idea of lived participation is a really interesting one, because that asks the practitioner to actually step into children's spaces rather than trying to invite children into their spaces. So this idea of getting out to where children are experiencing their daily lives and understanding how they function on a daily basis, how they move through their environment, how the urban environment impacts you, asks the practitioner to get out there and walk in their shoes with the children, to develop these safe but inclusive and trusting relationships where they can actually get a glimpse into the world of children. there's a lot of evidence of that happening in RISE that is not necessarily recognised as a legitimate form of participation, but the very act of practitioners being in the field collecting environmental samples and collecting health samples, it's exposing children to the opportunities where children can then decide whether or not they want to be a part of that. And children then choosing to participate in that by collecting samples in the field alongside the scientists. It's then part of their daily play activities where they're playing in that area already and they're asking to participate by collecting these samples. And this then provides the practitioner to give an educational response and build that trusting relationship by allowing the children to participate in a safe manner. So we know that these sorts of activities have real impact. Asking to join a walking school bus is a great way to understand the experience of walking to school with children in a safe way where there are other adults present, because you always have to apply a child protection lens. So there are a couple of examples that you can think about. How can you actually step safely into children's world to understand the world from their perspective, rather than expecting them to give up a part of their daily life to join in one of your activities.
Thanks, Robyn. And I'm happy to follow up with another question, but also remind everyone here to think of questions and comments yourself. So I guess one of the interesting things that I learned from being part of your supervision team is that there's a global context, a global policy context, if you like, that asks for or that mandates children participation in urban planning processes. But it doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen enough. Could you reflect maybe on what your research means for the design of global policy frameworks? So what could global policy frameworks maybe do better in order to actually have an impact on the ground? And if I can challenge you a little bit, even think about what would the implications be, for instance, for the Sustainable Development Goals framework, another global framework that, there's increasing evidence that what actually happens on the ground is limited compared to the ambitions of the framework so far. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So if you look at target 11.3 of the Sustainable Development Goals, that is looking for participatory practices to human settlement planning, there's no specific reporting process to understand how that is actually being enacted, other than through the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which requires reporting from signatories to the convention every 5 years. And it doesn't allow for, first of all, it's optional to report on participation frameworks for children. And secondly, it allows a very limited response from countries. So there's no great reporting focus on what countries are doing. Now, I don't necessarily agree that reporting alone is going to enact huge change, but what it does is it actually puts participation in as a prioritised area of focus. So it does send a message to governments that this is important and we expect you to start thinking about that. That's one aspect of that. The translation of it, there is a lot of research testing particular methods of participation that are then used to develop toolkits. So there's lots of toolkits within governments for participation, but it's still very limited in scope. There's still a real limitation on the research that has been done. And again, this idea of lived participation is fairly limited. So a lot of the activities that then occur are formal processes that fit in with the organisational activities. There's not necessarily a commitment to expand their time and space to be able to create something that is far more suitable for children and that fits in with the busy lives of children and families. So there's got to be a shift in how we expect children to participate in our processes and actually form processes around the way that children want to participate. That's an area that is really lacking in research. And so I think research is one way of really demonstrating how you do that in a safe way, because there are issues of power here that need to be acknowledged, and it does need to be done very safely with a child protection focus. But you can do it, and the research will help with that. And I think that kind of research also helps overturn this idea that children in vulnerable settings need to be recipients of assistance. It needs to then demonstrate that they are both a victim in a situation, but they are also an active citizen who have great capacity, and that can then, their participation can then shift that situation. I think getting the research out there about the impact of children's participation too is quite powerful. So even in the interviews that I've conducted and presenting this information, I quite often receive feedback that people don't necessarily understand the impact of children's participation and how powerful that is beyond a project itself, and that it has those broader societal ramifications.
Thanks, Robyn. There's a question from Bill in the chat. I'm just seeing if Bill maybe you would like to ask the question yourself. If not, I'm happy to ask it for you. And Carrie's also asking a question. Bill?
I'm there, Rob, if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go for it.
Oh, good. I'm just wondering, Robyn, the concept that you've talked about in the researching, do you think that could be applied in an urban growth area planning in a local government type setting?
Absolutely. There is research out there that's tested children's participation in processes that look at broad scale land use planning and planning schemes and the like. And what councils and government agencies are finding is that children do have the capacity to visualise and understand planning on a large scale, but they also bring in a very different focus on social connectedness and environmentally friendly approaches to those environments. So consistently, children tend to think more broadly about who is in their community, and they're more likely to identify how a place can better be designed to support more vulnerable populations. So the playground example that I use, children were very connected to Indigenous stories and impact on the land and country. Other stories that I've seen, children are very quick to talk about wanting to create cities and towns that are very supportive for people with disability and for elderly relatives such as grandparents. So they bring in a value-based approach to growth area planning that tends to be ignored a bit by authorities and the like, who might be looking more at a market-based model that's centred around economic return. So I absolutely think children should be involved in those, and I think if they're participating in a way where their voices are truly heard, and that translates to on-the-ground policy, that you would actually end up with very different looking new neighbourhoods and townships.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Robyn. Carrie, you've got a question in the chat as well. Would you like to ask that yourself? There you go.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, Robyn.
Sorry,
I'm in the office and it's a little bit noisy. I was just thinking through what you had been talking about, and based on our experience in RISE of really having to justify our community facilitated team on the ground to really, have the resources to engage in what we called co-design at the time. I just wonder what would be the elevator pitch for ensuring that there is, from a funding body, that there is resources allocated to children's participation, because I think for someone like me, I already see the benefit, and I know that it's, there are complexities and adds value in places you probably can't see, but I just wondered if you're trying to convince a funder what might be like the top 3 sort of things that you might get them across the line with. Yeah,
absolutely. There's a few different things that I would suggest there. One, it often comes down to what's in it for me. So the funder will have a particular set of goals and things that it's trying to achieve. So understanding what they are and then talking to that is a number one thing, and that's where that institutional model is really helpful. 2 is about understanding what participation is and how it fits within the work that you want to do. So some of the most valuable things that occurred in RISE, for example, didn't actually require any additional resources or time. They became a part of the daily activities, and in some cases they actually saved time. So identifying when you've got time pressures, how do you then build that into your daily practices? And part of that is around mindset as well. And that mindset is around, if you're implementing a project on the ground, that you're viewing children as an expert in that environment who can actually help you deliver that project more efficiently, more successfully, with longer term maintenance and governance, problem solving capacity. And it's actually going to support you to achieve those really difficult things. It also reduces burden on communities, because it gets you thinking differently about what participation then looks like. And that idea of lived participation reduces burden immensely, because you're not asking people to stop their daily lives. You're simply joining in and participating in their life in some way, and then adding value to their life, just as they're adding value to your project. So that'd be my main ones. And happy to talk more another time if you want.
Thanks, Kerry, and thanks, Robyn, for that. I'm going to check in if there's another question from anyone here. If not, I think we are done for today's seminar. And I would like to thank you again, Robyn, for giving this great presentation and making your time available in a time where you actually need to do many things for finishing up your PhD. Well done for that. And I would like to thank everyone in the audience for joining in and listening in and asking some of the questions. And if you ever want to have another look at it, feel free to reach out to the MSDI website, where you can find a recording of the webinar later on, and feel free to share that also with anyone that couldn't be here today. Thanks, everyone, and see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.